Good afternoon, everybody. It's so nice to have you all here join us today. I can't believe we are 6 months into COVID-19, social distancing, and attempts at quarantine. We're so glad to have everybody here join us today. It's fantastic. We are live streaming on Facebook at AmericanMuslimInstitution.com. As we've had major stories around social unrest in our rearview mirror and an upcoming election, I think it's really important that we don't forget some of the individual stories of people and also to get a sense of how those stories play a role in shaping the narrative, in changing people's perceptions, hearts, and minds. Oftentimes, we hear the media being criticized for how communities are imperfectly, often too harshly, or even too negatively covered. I think this is why today's conversation is so important. And it's a discussion about media and representation. And we have a phenomenal group of panelists on board with us today. The idea of this program started with a fellowship program. In the past, American Muslim Institution, AMI, has organized programs for students interested in studying journalism, in studying media and communications, to introduce them to people in those fields, but also to give them a sense of what careers are like and how they could actually have an impact. In the past, they've had an opportunity to visit the PBS NewsHour, New York Times, Washington Post, Netflix. They've had an opportunity to connect with thought leaders and other shakers and movers. Unfortunately, this year, given the current pandemic, we've been forced to go virtual. And I think going virtual has given us a tremendous opportunity. And that opportunity is to broaden our scope, not just to the DMV area, but nationally. We've been able to recruit students from all over the country and also been blessed to have participants from all over the country join us today. So we are all in for a fantastic treat. I'll start with the introductions. The first person we have joining us today is Amna Nawaz. She is the first Asian American and Muslim American to moderate a presidential debate. She currently hosts Beyond the Canvas, a half-an-hour program that showcases some of the nation's cultural creators. She joined PBS NewsHour in April 2018 and serves as a senior national correspondent and primary anchor. Prior to joining the NewsHour, Amna was an anchor and correspondent at ABC News, anchoring breaking news coverage and leading the network's digital coverage of the 2016 presidential election. Before that, she served as a foreign correspondent at NBC News, reporting from Pakistan, Afghanistan, Syria, Turkey, and the broader region. She is also the founder and former managing editor of NBC's Asian American platform, built to elevate voices of America's fastest growing population. In 2019, her reporting as part of NewsHour series on the global plastic problem was a recipient of a Peabody Award. While at NBC News, Nawaz reported documentary Robert's Country, a year in the most pro-Trump town, following four families' lives over President Trump's first year in office, and hosted the podcast series Uncomfortable, featuring in-depth one-on-one conversation with thought leaders and on the issues dividing America. Nawaz has been honored with an Emmy Award for NBC News special Inside the Obama White House, a Society for Features Journalism Award, and was a recipient of the International Reporting Project Fellowship in 2009. Amna, how are you? Nice to have you.
I'm very well. Thank you so much for having me. Good to see you, Ted.
It's a long time, long overdue. Next up, we have Marcellus Alexandro. Marcellus is the former president of the National Association of Broadcasters Leadership Foundation and executive vice president of NAB Television. He's a director on EW Scripps Company Board and a member of the Media Institute of the Caribbean Advisory Board. Marcellus served in the dual NAB roles for 15 years in Washington, D.C. Prior to that, he managed CBS-owned television stations in Philadelphia and Baltimore. His television responsibilities at the NAB included bringing an operator's perspective to legislative and regulatory discussions on Capitol Hill and at the Federal Communications Commission regarding issues impacting the broadcast business. As president of the NAV Leadership Foundation, his focus was on delivering its mission of providing broadcast training programs to strengthen and diversify our industry's workforce. He also oversaw initiatives in support of the First Amendment and philanthropy. A native of Austin, Texas, Marcellus holds a Bachelor of Science degree in journalism and speech from Texas State University. He has earned many awards over the years, among them his alma mater's Distinguished Alumni Award and an honorary doctorate of humane letters from Western Maryland College in recognition of his community service. Welcome, Marcellus. Nice to have you.
Thank you, Shahid, and thank you for hosting this important conversation.
Fantastic. Glad to see you again. And finally, we have Tahera Rahman. She's a reporter at KXAN News, the award-winning NBC TV station in Austin, Texas. Prior to that, she worked at a CBS TV station in the Quad Cities, where she made history in 2018 by becoming the first full-time TV reporter in the US to wear a hijab. Tahera had worked as a producer in both TV and radio for about 5 years before fulfilling her dream to be a TV reporter. Along with her passion for storytelling, Tahera loves to share her experience in the hopes of inspiring more Muslims to pursue journalism and not only be represented, but included in the news process. Welcome, everybody. It's so nice to have all of you.
Thank you for having us.
Fantastic, fantastic. We'll get right to it. I think everybody has been following the news and they have seen the recent history and groundbreaking debate, or rather presidential forum. Recently, Amna, you made history being the first Pakistani American and first American Muslim to moderate a presidential debate. What has the reaction been from your community and your colleagues?
Yes, I think it's fair to say the reaction from my family alone was overwhelming. Look, one of the things I do want to say is when we do these jobs, you never set out to be the first. That's not the goal when you do this work. You set out to be the best. And you hopefully putting your heart and your soul into it and the long hours and being the first one in and the last to leave and all of that, it pays off. And it doesn't always, and that's important to point out. But because there are very few people with my background and with my lived experience in this space, there's the opportunity to try to kick down some of those doors and to hold them open a little bit longer for people behind to walk through. And so, yeah, it actually kind of shocked me when someone pointed it out to me that I was the first Asian American to moderate a presidential primary debate, which, there have been plenty of amazing Asian American journalists before me and are still out there today. So that shocked me. It didn't surprise me that much that I was the first Muslim American to do so because there just frankly aren't that many of us in broadcast television. There are more. And so that didn't quite surprise me. But I'll say this, I think a couple of things happen when you end up occupying a space that no one has occupied before. One is that there's an immense outpouring of pride and support and encouragement. And I absolutely saw that. And that is heartening and satisfying and fills me in a way that I never expected to be filled from the work that I do professionally. And on the flip side, there is this additional pressure. There are people reaching out to you to say, okay, now that you're there to represent us and you have to ask these questions and we need to make sure that these things get covered. And it's a very delicate balance for anyone in this role because you carry with you obviously all of your professional burden and responsibilities, and my duty is to the facts and fidelity to the facts without fear or favor as a journalist, but you also carry the burden of representation. And this is often the case regardless of your background when you're one of the first in the door or one of the onlys in the room. And so there's a very delicate balance because you cannot let one inform and influence the other. So the reaction after the debate, I have to say, was even stronger because I got a lot of people saying, I can't believe you didn't ask this question. I can't believe you didn't press harder on this. And as my father likes to tell me, if you're taking it from all sides and basically everyone from every part of the spectrum is unhappy with you in some way, you're probably doing something right. So my takeaway in all of this was I did the best job I could. I hope I made people proud. And I hope that there are more like me in the years ahead.
Tahera, did you have a similar experience as being the first hijabi to be on broadcast news?
100% yes. And everything Amna said was just speaking right to me, because she's absolutely right in that there are two sides to your feelings and your emotions. You're proud, you're happy that you've finally kind of opened that door. And hopefully the hope is that it is a little bit easier and a little bit less daunting for others after you. But at the same time, there is that pressure, and even just as far as your appearance, right? And women get this in broadcast all the time. Don't get me wrong. No matter what background you are, no matter if you're wearing a headscarf or not, but you know, you're representing an entire community, whether you like it or not. And so the way you wear your hijab, that's not proper. You know, how much makeup you have. And so for me, just like Amna said, it's keeping a focus on why you're here, why you got here, and why you're staying here. It's for the job, it's for the facts, it's for the story. And that's the core belief that really drives you forward in the industry. It's not the praise and it's not the criticism, it's the job itself and focusing on that. So
Fantastic. Thank you so much. You know, Marcellus, I think you have been in the industry amongst all of the panelists here perhaps the longest. And I think perhaps you can share some insights and thoughts on how you have seen this representation play out over time as a priority, or maybe it hasn't been. Would you care to share?
Absolutely. First of all, I would say that we have, as an industry, had some forward progress, but we have a long, long way to go. And that's at almost every level of our business, from people who are on the air, reporters and journalists like Tahera and Amna, as well as news directors, general managers, owners of stations. All of those areas we are dramatically underrepresented. And I'm talking about minorities in general, people of color. There are programs, there are different initiatives to help move that needle forward, if you will. And I'm encouraged by some of those efforts, but we do have quite a ways to go before we reach the kind of representation that reflects the various communities that our properties serve and that our journalists and other employees serve.
Thank you so much. So right now we'll take a question from one of our participants. Give me 1 second. Inaya Sheikh, you are up.
Hi, my name is Inaya Sheikh. I live in Texas and I'm considering studying law as I go into college. Tahera, my question is for you. Is there a lack of representation in the media, and how can we get younger students like myself and my peers to go into that field?
that's a good question. I think, like Marcellus said, we have come a long way in the industry, and just the fact that I went on air in 2018 and was the first was mind-blowing. Like Amna said, like, we're in the year 2000s and we're having these firsts now is pretty crazy, especially in America, where we pride ourselves in being diverse and having the ability to move up and to go wherever you want as long as you work hard. But it is heartening to see that there are so many more of us now. And I'd like to think that we are very open and welcoming to others. And so I say this all the time for advice is reach out to us. I mean, I've had maybe a handful of people reach out to me via social media or email. As journalists, all of our social media handles are out there for the world to see, and we're very accessible. So I think that's the first step, is even if you're not sure you want to do it, pick our brains about it, because I had very few people. I was lucky to be born and raised in the Chicago area where it is diverse, and I did have people of color that I could tap and ask their experiences and kind of pick their brains. But at the same time, even then, even being exposed to this diversity, I never even considered, like, it wasn't even in my sphere of thought to be a broadcast journalist. It just isn't something that you saw. It's just nothing that ever crossed my mind until I took a class in college and I loved it. And then I thought, is this something I could do? Can I do this as a job? And so I realized, that's when I started looking around, and I would realize, oh my gosh, there is no one that wears a hijab. I don't know how difficult this is going to be. But the good thing is that, and I say this all the time, that all the challenges that I face and all the barriers that I face, they're not new. They're not new at all. But I would not change them either, because I feel like it has helped me empathize in my storytelling. It's helped me work harder. And looking down the road, for anybody else that wants to fill this position or a similar role, I'm here to help, and I can understand you and give you advice, and my experiences hopefully will shape others. So that's my first piece of advice. It's just to reach out to anyone that you think might be able to guide you in any way. And then just work hard at trying to get those experiences. I mean, I had like 3 or 4 internships, and for one of my internships, I had to try for like 2 years to get it at Al Jazeera English, but it was worth it, and it helped me. Whether you like it or not, it'll help shape your path. You know, that's how I decided I didn't want to do solely digital journalism. I wanted a TV broadcast aspect to it. So I would say reach out, and then also get those valuable experiences, work experiences.
Fantastic. Does anybody else want to share some advice on how do we get some more young people involved in the field?
I'd be happy to. From the place that I used to work, Shahid, the National Association of Broadcasters Leadership Foundation, they have a number of different programs designed exactly to address that caller's, viewers' needs. If you go to the nableadership.org, there are a number of different programs designed to attract new talent to our business in a number of different levels, technology, news, other levels as well. So, and most of those programs are not, don't come with a cost. So that's another option that people have. Go to that website, see what they have to offer, and go from there.
Thank you.
And Shad, I just want to add one thing to that, which is to underscore something Tahera said, because journalism and law and whatever field it is that you decide to go into, you should know that your relationships actually matter so much more than people will tell you often, even that they do. And I know a lot of times, I know I growing up was told over and over again, you just work hard and the work will speak for itself. And, you know, life is a meritocracy. And to some degree, that is true. You have to put in the work. But sometimes being able to get that perspective about what the field is really like, or getting that first internship, or getting your resume to the top of the pile so someone actually takes a look at it in the sea of resumes that they have, sometimes that takes knowing someone and being able to say, you know what, I actually reached out to Tahera on Instagram and she told me that she got her start here, and that's why I'm really excited to apply here. And just being able to establish your own network, which can feel a little like disingenuous sometimes, but it's not, because this is about people and this is about building your network and about making sure that others know how good you are and how valuable an asset and a team member you would be.
So let me get that straight. You're suggesting it's not only important what you know, but it's also just as important who you know.
Absolutely. And I think you can be very genuine in building those relationships. The very first people who ever gave me my very first jobs in this industry, I am still in close contact with today. And I speak to them regularly, and they're still my mentors, and they have seen my kids grow up, and I have watched their kids go off to college. And these are relationships. And I think at the core of that is something that's very basic for all of us as human beings, which is that we need each other. None of this happens alone. And it's not just in TV, which I like to call a team sport, because nothing happens alone, but we all need each other to be able to move forward.
Fantastic. Okay, so we'll take another question from one of the audience members, Anam Khan. Okay, Anam. Anam, you're muted. Oh, there you go.
Hi, my name is Anam Khan, and I'm from Rockville, Maryland. I plan to study public policy and computer science. And my question is for Marcellus. Is there a financial case to be made for diversity and representation in the media and the press?
Absolutely. And, you know, when we talk about representation, particularly in the news departments or the news areas, it's basically logic that says, if you have representation on your staff, that reflects the audience that you're serving, that is a part of that audience that you're serving, you're going to deliver more relevant news, more topical news, news that that audience is interested in, that community is interested in. When you do that, this thing called ratings goes up, and that generates revenue and puts money to the bottom line. So there is absolutely a direct connection between diversity, or the business case for diversity, and also news departments. But even broader than that, all of the major business consulting firms, the McKinseys, the Deloittes, the Boston Consulting Groups, all of them have done extensive work. We're talking about sample sizes of 1,000 over 15 countries, and just a lot of work that basically arrives at an overwhelming conclusion. And that conclusion is the diverse teams, those that reflect age, gender, experience diversity, the diverse teams and ethnicity, I didn't say that I wanted to, those teams routinely outperform on all kinds of metrics their peers who don't do that, their peer companies who don't do that. It's just overwhelming, the statistics. Now, as an industry and as an industry and as business, we have not moved as quickly as we should to capture that benefit, but there is progress that's being made.
So I think there's a question in the chat. I think it goes very much in hand with what you were saying. And that question is, how do we normalize diversity in media and television? So you're saying we're not there yet, but there is a financial case to be made. How do we get there? This is from Shafiq.
Sure. So it really takes buy-in from the top. And when the CEO or the owners of the companies understand that dynamic, that with diversity comes profit. With diversity, it's not only the right thing to do, the moral right thing to do, but with diversity, there is actually going to be a payoff. When that message is from the top and it's embraced, and there are strategies that are intentional, not accidental, they're intentional, then those wheels or that needle moves a little bit more quickly. And again, a lot of companies are embracing this move toward diversity, but we have to move a little bit quicker, in my view.
Have Amna or Tahera found that perhaps when you joined the industry, there was not as many people looking like you, but perhaps the landscape has changed in the last few years? And what has that been like?
Yeah, so I'll say I started my very first internship, my fellowship actually, in the fall of 2001. And I was the only brown woman in the room. I was definitely the only Muslim in the newsroom. And that has changed over time, not as much as you might have thought that it should have. And I think that is what, to Marcellus's point, that is where we are today, which is that institutions just naturally are slow to change, and they require a great amount of force applied, both from within and externally, in order to change. And we're still very much in that process. I don't think I've ever been in a newsroom where I felt like, well, this is very representative of most of the country. But I will say also to Marcellus's point that when, yes, if you have buy-in from the top, that makes everything a whole lot easier because everyone's on the same page and everything kind of falls in line from there. When you don't have that buy-in from the top, which is probably the position a lot of people out there will find themselves in, it's really helpful and useful, I have found, to make the case, not based on what you believe is the right thing to do, because I think we can all agree what the right thing to do is, but based on that kind of business and production model. So when I launched Asian America at NBC, we already had what we called a vertical, kind of a cross-platform publication that was mainly producing news and information and content for African Americans. And there was also one for Latino Americans. There wasn't one for Asian Americans. And that was largely because most people thought, well, it's a small segment of the population, we don't really need to do it. But I knew from the circles that I traveled in, not just in Muslim American circles, but South Asian American circles and others, that there was a ton of great storytelling that wasn't being done. And that oftentimes it got kind of lost and diluted in the rest of the reporting. And so when I pitched it, I did my research and I said, this is where we are in terms of digital content consumption in this community. This is the population pyramid we're looking at. This is where the numbers are from Nielsen. And that is what got us the initial funding to say, okay, let's do something. And in less than a year, because there had never been that kind of platform before. It grew to, I think we had over like 1 million a month in terms of viewership and content consumption within the first year. So there was a void that needed to be filled, and we found a way to fill it. But for me, it's sort of a mid-level rank when I launched that. I couldn't just go to them and say, hey, that's not fair. You know, there's one group, but there's one publication here and one publication there, but not one for Asian Americans. It's the right thing to do. I had to say, here are the numbers, here's the audience, here's what I think we should do. And that's what helped to get it off the ground. And I think that can work across the industry, across any industry really, but you have to make the business case to get it done.
Tahera?
Yeah, so I have two things. One, just on a way smaller scale, individual scale, I have not launched any shows or anything, but I can say that in my journey to not yet, that's true. In my journey to going on air, and anyone who's like heard my story or read it knows that it took me several years and lots of rejections. And I remember one of the last rejections I got, I had emailed my news director, and I said, and this is the part where both Amna and Marcellus are talking about, where we all know the moral thing, right? But what else is there? And so that's where I kind of laid out. I basically, in a nutshell, I understand and respect your decision. I do think that we're missing an opportunity for growth here. This is why X, Y, and Z, I think I am better than any other candidate that walks through this door. I know the area. I've been here for 2 years as a producer. I know all the key figures, all the mayors. I know what questions to ask. I know how the newsroom runs. What else can I do to make sure that next time a position opens up, I am not only considered, but I'm being granted that opportunity? And so I left it on them. I said, I love working here, and I'm going to continue to work hard. Tell me how I can improve. And I think making yourself open to that kind of critique kind of softens everything. And they know that you're in it for the right reasons. You're not in it just to be on TV. You're not in it just for the fame or glory, but you're in it to actually be a good journalist. And I think that helped. And in many ways, not just with the leadership at my station, but I didn't know this until after I had gotten on air, that the anchors at my station had gone into my general manager's office and told him that he was missing an opportunity, that I was the hardest working and best journalist in the building. And I nearly cried when I found that out a few weeks after I had gotten the job. I had no idea that they had done that. And so I think that goes to, and even in our religion, that goes to the fact that your actions should speak louder than your words, right? And that's the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. His character spoke more than he did about himself. And so that, I think, is something crucial that we can retain from our prophetic tradition. And just a small story too, to talk about the way that the industry has already changed just in my few years since being on air. One of the reporters now, her name is Aya Galal, shout out to her. She's on the East Coast, and she had reached out to me after seeing my story and said, you know, I'm also a producer. I've always wanted to be on air. Your story is inspiring, and I really hope that I can do that one day. And fast forward to 2 years later, I am part of this Multimedia Journalists for Women group. And I saw her post in there about one of her stories, and I was like, oh my God, she made it on air. And we talked, and she talked about how she made it on air just a few months before, and that she has been loving being a journalist. And she is also the only Muslim woman who wears a hijab in her area, in her viewing area. And so I thought that was a very telling snapshot of where we are right now in the industry and in America itself. The fact that we are granting more of these opportunities, and hopefully they only increase going forward.
Shahid, let me underscore very quickly the key point, one of the key points that Tahera just made, and that is going to a manager, the approach of going to a manager and saying, what else do I need to do to be more effective? What else do I need to do to bring more to the table? If you have a manager who doesn't want that conversation, you're probably at the wrong place. That's the kind of attitude that everybody, any manager who's worth his or her salt, would want to be able to share with an employee, here's what I need, here's what I think you can do. That's a perfect, perfect approach. And it's one of the reasons I think that Tahera has had the success that she's had thus far.
Thank you, Marcellus, for sharing. I think one of the things that everyone is very much interested here specifically in knowing is how do we actually shift the perception? How do we shift different narratives? And I think we have a great case study to talk about. I mean, we are living through 2020. We're seeing a lot of social unrest. And I wanted to actually, I know Bilal Aksoy, he has a question related to this. And so I will have him just ask his question. And I think it'll get more to the point. Bilal, you're up.
Everyone, thanks so much for doing this. So my question is, what lessons can Muslims and even other groups who feel they get a bad reputation from the media learn from the Black Lives Matter movement, especially as it relates to how their communities are covered?
So I'll add a little bit to that also. I think in the last 6 months, we've seen a huge shift in perception in the US regarding the Black Lives Matter movement. And perhaps it was negative, and now perhaps it's positive. And that shift is tremendous over only a very short amount of time. And kind of, I think what Bilal is asking is, A, how did that happen? And B, what can other communities learn from that? Anyone feel free to.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Marcellus, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Amna.
I was just going to say, I think the context to BLM is it's not just in the last 6 months. It's really been the last 3 years. I mean, it's really been ever since Ferguson. We have seen support within Americans, and polling backs this up, really increasing for what we're now calling the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And I think the killing of George Floyd was the latest and most extreme example of people being forced to reckon with something that has long been happening in communities across America and is now suddenly in the forefront. I'll also point out, if you look at just the recent polling, that support has started to dip, specifically among white Americans. And I think you have to kind of keep in mind that support for civil rights in general ebbs and flows as a reflection of where people are in their lives and where their attention is. And of course, we're having this conversation during a global pandemic, which we cannot ignore. So I want to talk about a couple of things. One is just the general support, and also how the media talks about it and lessons to be learned, because that support, I think, is important in the context of how Americans have moved on. Another key issue is when you look at support for like same-sex marriage, which was dramatic in terms of how quickly and how widespread it grew in just a matter of years. And so what we've seen in American history is when the country is ready, so to speak, which we can talk about in a different way, but when the country is ready, the country is able to progress on a huge issue very quickly and very suddenly, and there can be big steps, big monumental social steps on the back end of that. And I think because of where we are right now, a lot of people think now is another one of those times where we are able to talk about what that next great step for society means. But the media's role in all of this, I think, is also important. And this is a conversation we have often in our newsrooms, which is how much do you reflect where people's interests are, and how much do you continue to put in front of them the stories that you know are important, even if their interest isn't necessarily there. And so one of the things we've seen is when the polling comes up and says, well, people's interest, I will say specifically white Americans' interest and support for Black Lives Matter has kind of gone down. Do we need to pay as much attention to the protests anymore? And there is a group of us that say, yes, we absolutely do, and here is why. And you can cite historical examples of when media stops talking about things, people stop covering stories, and there's kind of an effect after that where people think, well, maybe it's not that important, it's not that much of a problem anymore. So there is that responsibility upon us, I think, to make sure that we are putting those stories out in front of the people and in front of our audiences. But in terms of what we can learn, I have gone back again and again in the way that I've covered racial justice and social justice in America to, if you look at American history and modern American history, Black Americans have always led the way when it comes to our civil rights and our fight for basic human rights in this country. And the Asian American movement followed in the steps that were led by Black Americans. And what we see now, again, is as diverse as this movement is, and I know this is why people say it's different this time, it is still led by Black Americans. And I think centering the voices of the people on the front lines and centering those leaders and making sure you're elevating those leaders is the kind of way that we continue to cover this in the most accurate and fair way, because those are the two things that guide everything that we do, right? Are we being accurate? Are we being fair? And is it necessary for us to do this? So that's where we're approaching this from my newsroom's perspective, at least at this time, is making sure that when you're covering it, it's not just about, well, people have lost interest, so we're going to move on. It's really, what do we as a news organization hold up as a priority, and who are the right voices that we elevate in telling that story?
And if I could add to what Amna's points, there's no question that the 7 minutes and 48-second video of the police officer with his knee on George Floyd's neck impacted lots of people. There's no way any human wouldn't be impacted and affected by that. And as a result, as Amna just said, the outpouring of support for the movement and for the social justice piece and police brutality, all was amazing to see the cross-section of folks supporting it. Unfortunately, in a political year, the violence and destruction associated with those protests has now gotten a much bigger spot in the media. And I think when it comes to media, if you look at, do I report on a peaceful protest, or do I report burning buildings and that kind of thing? Clearly there's going to be an appetite for the latter, because that's more jarring and it's going to get eyeballs, right? But it's a balancing act for the group and for the movement. For protests to be effective, in my opinion, they have to be disruptive enough to hold attention, but also retain the support of the masses to keep moving forward and putting pressure on politicians to make change. And in an election year where this one has certainly been politicized, the riots have taken the forefront and everything is now through the political lens, it's very, very difficult. I suspect, and one other complicating factor here, I suspect that with that backdrop, and I'm sure that the Black Lives Matter leadership has thought this through, but perhaps with the benefit of hindsight, the defund the police moniker might be rethought, perhaps. And again, I know there's a lot of discussion around that, but when a message is not clear, or when people can't understand exactly what's that going to look like, it lends itself to being hijacked, as it has been for whether it's violence or destruction or other political reasons. So my hope is, going back again to something that Amna just said, there is a hope that this time, or there's a feeling that this time is different, that there is enough momentum going forward that we can keep this movement going, because change is absolutely necessary, and it's going to require the whole movement to continue with the support of a lot of different folks. So it's complicated, but I think we can and should and will move forward with this.
I will just add just a tiny bit to that, in that with any large scale movement, there's going to be a spectrum of thoughts, ideas, beliefs, and even right down to the protesters, different reasons why they're all out there. And so I think on their side of things, it's clear, it's necessary to have clear leaders and a clear agenda. And I think, at least in Austin, we have seen a good representation of that, where we've seen two major groups emerge from the local BLM movement. And one will give us a clear outline of, hey, this is our map, this is our path for our march, this is why we're doing it. And anything else that comes out of this, we don't condone and we don't approve of. So then we as the media know, okay, this is the main movement, and there might be subsections, there might be kind of like the renegade groups, but now we know where that is in context of at least the Austin BLM protests. And I think that at least from the coverage that we have been doing, we've done a pretty good job of putting that into context for our viewers as well. And even when a car catches on fire, we can say, this protest started at 9 a.m. The organizers were clear that they didn't condone any of this violence. This happened at 11 p.m., 2 hours after the official march ended. We don't know who exactly started this, et cetera, et cetera. So I think in that way, you can separate yourself from the, any negative images that you might be fearful of for your movement. And in that same vein, I think that's why it's so important to make sure you have that constant communication with media, because I'm sure everyone on this panel has experienced this at one point or another, but I still do, where I'm on the ground, I'm on deadline, and I have to be live at 5 o'clock, and I'm 0 for 6, and nobody wants to talk to the media. Everyone says, oh, we don't talk to media. And just think about, I understand that there's hesitancy sometimes, but just think about the bigger picture and what message that sends to the media. I mean, how, for another journalist who's not as persistent, you could stop after 3 people and just say, nobody wants to talk to me. I'm going to go with the most vocal person who might not be representative of your group.
Thank you so much, Tahera. Thanks for sharing, everybody. I think Marcellus touched on a very important point, and I think everyone has touched on it. We are in a very politically charged environment, and the news is being accused of either being fake or real or having a political agenda. And I wanted to really ask you guys, as journalists or people in the industry, I mean, what is it like right now to be on the field? And number 2, do you guys find yourselves or your peers trying to inject themselves into the story versus reporting on the story? I mean, from what you hear on television, especially in the political environment, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of reporting going on, at least from that angle. So do you see that there is a balance between reporting on the news and being the news? Marcellus, can we start with you? I know you and I have talked about this quite a bit.
Yeah, so it's a little tricky, and I want to make sure that we're speaking the same language here. When we talk about journalists becoming the story, that in my mind is a little different than perhaps a journalist providing a little bit of personal context for the story. But it's not about them. A good example of that might be when many of the networks did coverage, the broadcast networks did coverage of the unrest, and some of the African-American journalists were asked to opine or have some reflection in terms of what they went through or what they might have seen in their lives and that type of thing that shapes who they are today. And I think when it comes across as authentic, and again, they're not the story. They are clearly not the story, but they show a little bit of themselves that I think engages the audience, makes them more familiar with the audience, and in the best case scenario, more trusted by the audience because they are authentic in the way they do it. But that line is very thin. You can't, in my opinion, you don't want to be the story, but you can reflect and add something that adds dimension and context to a story.
Amna, would you like to share?
I agree 100% with Marcellus, which is that you never want to be the story as the journalist. That is not why you're there. You're there because millions of other people can't be there. And so you're there to ask the questions that they would want answered if they were able to be there and see what you're seeing and talk to the people you're talking to. At the same time, look, the press is under historic, unprecedented attack from the highest levels of government right now. And we have to acknowledge that. And we also have to acknowledge that sometimes the situations we're reporting from are incredibly hostile. And I can't tell you the number of times I've been to a Trump rally in particular and had things yelled at me, both because of what I look like, but also just because I'm a member of the press. And that's also something we have to acknowledge and put in its proper place. So I agree with Marcellus that there's an absolute need, I think, much more so today, both because of the environment that we're working in, but also because of the nature of news today, to add that little bit of context. Because just being straight down the line with here is a presentation of what this person said versus what this person said doesn't quite meet the balance of fairness to me right now, because when you have one side saying one thing and one side espousing neo-Nazi sentiment, to me the balance is not halfway down the middle. Because a lot of people, and I get asked this all the time, will say, well, are you, are you Republican or a Democrat? Like, which side are you on? What do you believe? And I have never been affiliated with any major political party. And so my answer is always to say, like, I'm on the side of the facts and I'm on the side of the evidence. And that is where I go. And sometimes that evidence means that you're providing what I call analysis, which is both a combination of your lived experience. I have covered a dozen rallies like this, and that's why I'm able to tell you why this is unique, or this is something that regularly happens, or I have lived as a visible person of color for all of my life, and that is why I can tell you it is unusual for the president to say, go back to where you came from, to members of Congress, or whatever the context is that's necessary, because there is the fact that you're reporting, and then there's the context that is necessary to understand why it's important, why it's significant, not to tell you what to think at all, but to tell you this is something you should be thinking about. And that's a very careful balance for every journalist right now, and depending on the person and depending on the outlet, that manifests itself in a lot of different ways. But I mean, you need look no further than the Minneapolis protests after the killing of George Floyd, and you saw my colleague from CNN, Omar Jimenez, who himself was arrested, even though he was there as a clearly identified member of the press. He wasn't trying to be the story, but he became the story in that moment, because what happened to him was emblematic of what's happening across the country. So it's a different time, but I think everyone's kind of trying to meet the moment in their own way and still stay true to the facts.
Tahera, would you like to share?
I think they hit it on the head, and I'm learning from what they're saying, so taking it all in.
Fantastic. So we just have one more question from Reyes, and I'll do a little bit of interpretation. So I think he's specifically asking for what sort of advice might you have for Muslim Americans or other minorities on how they should be involved in trying to shape the perception of how the media views them. So whether, yeah, I think it's pretty broad. I'll let you guys take this anywhere you want to. Tahera, you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, I think it definitely starts with a piece of the advice that I gave for young journalists or people who might be interested is just keeping that line of communication open. And that is so basic, but it's something, Shahid, that a lot of people still don't do. And I think that, first of all, identifying who you need to know in a newsroom is important. So for usually in newsrooms, it's news directors and producers that usually make the call. Like I as a reporter can pitch my story and make a case for it, but at the end of the day, I'm not the one who decides whether or not I go for it. So it would be helpful to know a producer, but even reporters who are out there on the ground, if they give you your card, take it. If you can find them, if you can reach out to them and talk to them. And it's with a caveat that not every story you tell them about will get covered. And that's something I tell them all the time. It just depends on the news of the day, and it depends on what's going on. And I never promise that I can give you coverage or I can, tell your story, but I can certainly try. And there have been so many instances where I have not covered, for example, something in the Muslim community. I haven't been able to, we didn't have enough resources, but I really appreciate them continuing to reach out to me and telling me about everything that's going on so that we can get to the point where we are covering things, at least the most important things. And we have a relationship with them, I think is most important, before an emergency, before something bad happens and we want reaction from the Muslim community. I think it's important to display those Muslim voices in different aspects of our lives, because that's what we're involved in. We are part of the fabric of society, and we should be represented that way, not just in the context of some event happening and reaction to that event. So I think that helps shape the narrative of a community, is when you have those relationships in place, you can offer up people and in many different aspects for many different stories, not just Muslim focused, I guess.
And Shahid, I don't know if we have time for one quick follow on. From my backpack of experiences when I was a general manager, one of the most effective things that a group could do would be to call the general manager and say, I'd like to meet with you. And I've had these meetings over the years as general manager with various groups, African-American groups, others, and they would present to me, here's what our challenges are. And I can remember meeting with a group of Black ministers as a for instance, and they would say things like, you know, the media never covers the good stuff that we do. We only see ourselves when there's a negative story. And I said, I understand that, but we need to know what those good stories are. So let's make the connection to Tahera's point. Let's establish a relationship so that we know what's going on in those communities, good, bad, and indifferent. As she said, we can't promise you that we're going to cover every story that you bring, but we want to know what those stories are, because if we are doing our jobs, we are reflecting the entire community. And so reaching out to the leadership at stations, I think, is extremely important. And again, if a general manager doesn't want to take that kind of a meeting, I'd be surprised. Most of them should and do. There may be a few outliers, but I encourage them to reach out to those general managers and others.
Amna, any parting thoughts on this issue?
No, I just agree 100% with everything Tahera and Marcellus have said. It goes back to relationships to me, which is, you know, you find the right people, you keep up your relationships with them. It is a very basic thing about human connections and trust, I think, and that trust has to work both ways, right? You have to, as someone taking your story somewhere, you have to trust that the person's going to handle it with the care and attention you'd want. And as journalists, you know, we want to be able to trust our sources of information. And so, you know, it's something, especially I think as journalists, we're working hard right now to make sure that we have rebuilt within the communities. It is that level of trust. I'll also say one thing, which is a bit of a pet peeve of mine, and I'll point it out now, which is we keep saying the word media as if it is this one big monolith. And I feel compelled to remind people that, like, Twitter is media and Netflix is media. And so if you are sharing things on Facebook or posting on your Instagram, you are also part of the media. Just because you don't get a paycheck from a corporation does not mean you are not publishing and part of the media. And so I think, you know, the duty and responsibility in storytelling really lies with all of us, not just in terms of where we're applying the pressure, but how we're presenting and representing ourselves.
That's a fantastic point. Actually, Marcellus and I were discussing this yesterday. Who exactly is media? And, you know, as far as I'm concerned, I mean, I get a lot of my news from Netflix. And does that mean Netflix is my news source and it's the media?
And it very well might be, right? Like Facebook is also a huge source of information, a primary source of information for people. I'll also say my other favorite thing is when I go to talk to someone and I'm literally interviewing someone and they will say, you know, the media never covers this and the media never covers that. And I'll say, you're literally talking to a member of the media right now. So, you know, I think it does go back to that level of trust, which is that once you've made that connection with someone, trust that the story is going to be handled in the right way. And if it's not, then you know, and you can move on and you can find a wonderful journalist like Tahera out there to put your story with and make sure it's treated properly.
Fantastic. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. We are a little bit over time, but I would give you guys the floor for any final thoughts if you'd like to share anything to the audience.
Well, I would say, again, thank you for hosting this conversation. I think it helps to share what's going on in the media space as broadly as we defined it. And I would say one other thing on the media, there is objective reporting, right? Objective media, and then there is opinion media. And understanding that very key distinction is very important. Everybody who's on the air who's saying they are a journalist are not. There are opinion hosts, typically on cable channels, typically. And then there are journalists, typically on broadcast news, local radio and television stations. I'll throw one plug in. There's an organization called Newsy, N-E-W-S-Y, and in full disclosure, it is a Scripps company. They are a source of good news and objective news. But you have to understand when you're searching for your content, what your platform matters. And journalists versus others matter as well. And we have two great journalists here. Follow these two and others like them, and you'll be informed, not influenced.
Fantastic. Tahera, parting words?
Yeah, I would just, this is for all the young ones on here, is just, I hope that the current climate and atmosphere doesn't make you shy away from the industry or journalism as a whole, because I do think it's important now more than ever, and it will be going forward. It always has been, it always will be, to not only be diverse in our representation, but also the inclusion. And that means that you're not only being shown on TV, you're part of that news gathering process. And those lived experiences that we've been talking about as a Muslim American, as a Black American, are so valuable in the way that we gather news and the way that we contextualize these stories. And so think about your part in history, really, and shaping and informing that. You are the first draft of history as journalists. And I always think about that, and I always think about how great it would be to have more of us out there to be telling these stories, because the way that I see it and the way that even my husband, a white American, sees it is sometimes very different, judging on our lived experiences. So I would really encourage you to take a look at that, and of course reach out to us if you need guidance on that.
Amna, any last words for our future budding journalists on the call today?
I'm so glad that there are future budding journalists out there, I will say. And I think, you know, we talk about representation. The truth that we're all speaking to is that it's really, until you see it, it's hard to be it. And so when you're the first through the door, and unless you've seen someone who looks like you, has your experience, it's hard to say, I can imagine myself in that space. And so I think for, you know, young journalists of color, young Muslim journalists, you have those examples out there. It's no longer a question of, you know, can I do it? It's, do you want to do it? And to that end, I would say, yes, you have to own your own story. If you're unhappy with the way your story is being told, you should be the one to tell it. So don't shy down. Don't be afraid to be ambitious with owning that kind of storytelling. It doesn't have to be through a traditional journalistic outlet. I think there's so many different ways to tell our stories these days that you should find the one that speaks to you. And then don't be afraid, to the points that were made earlier. Don't be afraid to reach out. Don't be afraid to ask for guidance and ask for mentorship, and learn from the people who've come before you, and trust that we're holding the doors open for you. So I'm just really grateful to be here with y'all and to see the fabulous work that Tahera is doing. I'm so proud of her and can't wait to see everything she does. And I'm so grateful to the leadership Marcellus has provided. And I think it's a really, really good time, really good necessary time to be a journalist in America. I'll leave it with that.
Thank you guys so much, Tahera. Thank you, Amna and Marcellus. You guys have been fantastic. I know that our future journalists have learned quite a bit, and they are very much trying to absorb all the advice you've shared. And for our audience, thank you so much for joining us today. Hopefully we got to some of your questions. This broadcast will be on our YouTube channel, American Muslim Institution, and also will be on our Facebook, American Muslim Institution. Hopefully you were able to gain some of the valuable insights, and hopefully we're able to continue this conversation going forward. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.